Thanks for tuning in at Brackeys.
Hello everyone and welcome to this video on creating a tower defense game in Unity. Today we are going to be doing something really exciting, which is making a wave spawner 2.0. So today we're going to expand the functionality of our wave spawner quite a bit, make it a lot more customizable. We're going to introduce this concept of waves where we can edit properties for each individual wave. So we will be able to have different enemies for different waves, just drag in the prefab so we can change their look and their health, their speed, stuff like that. And we'll also be able to control the amount of enemies we spawn and the rate they spawn at for each individual wave. So really exciting video, and let's just jump right into it. So I'm here in Unity and I want to begin by just getting an overview over how we currently have things configured. So let's look under our game master and go to the wave spawner script, and you can see here that we currently have a few variables. The main problem with this is that we only have this central enemy prefab, and that means that we will be spawning the same enemy for each individual wave, which quickly becomes pretty boring for our user. So let's now just double click on our wave spawner script and have a look at how this actually works. So you can see again we have this enemy prefab. We also have a reference to our spawn point and our wave countdown text. That stuff we still need in here. Then we have this countdown float, and this is probably the most important variable because it's what keeps track of when we need to spawn the next wave. And basically we set this equal to the time between waves, and then we just slowly reduce it and make sure to display it and all that until it reaches 0, in which case we spawn a new wave and then again set it back to the time between waves, which is currently just set to 10. So every 10 seconds, no matter if we actually kill off the wave or not, there's going to spawn a new one. And I kind of want to change how that works. Instead, what I wanted to do is only spawn a new wave in case we killed off the last one. And actually, I want it to be in such a way that the countdown doesn't start until the previous wave is dead. And then we can have a very tiny countdown, say 3 or 5 seconds until the next wave. So I think that just helps separate things. It makes things easier both for the user and also kind of to separate things out for ourselves. So in order to do this, what I want to do is keep track of how many enemies we have in the scene, because we need to know if we've actually killed off the wave. And in order to do this, let's just create a new variable. Let's just make this at the very top, and it's going to be public because we want to be able to access it from without the script. And we also want it to be static, again, because we want our enemies, whenever they die, to be able to change this value. So we want a public static int, and we'll call this our enemies alive, and we want to default that to 0. Then what we do is each time we spawn an enemy, and we have a handy method for that down here, we of course instantiate the enemy prefab, and then we can go enemies alive plus plus. So we simply add one onto the currently existing value. So each time we spawn an enemy, we now increase this value. Now we need to also decrease it when an enemy despawns. And in order to do that, we simply need to find our enemy script in here. Just double click on that. And you can see that we have a method here for killing off the enemy called die. So each time an enemy dies, we want to go in here. We want to say wave spawner, and again, because this is a static variable, we don't need a reference to the instance of the class. We can simply use the type. So we'd simply go wave spawner dot enemies alive, and then minus minus. We simply want to subtract 1 from the current amount of enemies alive. So that's really easy, except there's actually one case where our enemy gets removed from the scene, but the die method isn't called, and that's the case where our enemy actually slips through our defenses and gets to the end of our level. In that case, inside of our enemy movement, it reaches the end of its path, and then we subtract some lives and we destroy the object. And here it doesn't call any die method. So in here we also need to go wave spawner dot enemies alive minus minus. So there we go. So now we actually keep track of the current amount of enemies in our scene. And we can use this in here. All we need to do is kind of say if, and we can do that up here, if our, so if enemies alive is greater than 0, well then we can simply return out of our update function. Then we don't want to do any of this stuff happening down here. And I actually believe that's all the code that we need to add. So if we just go through this, so it's the countdown is going to start at 2. It's going to go through here. It's going to go down. It's not no enemies are alive, and it's not reached 0 yet. So it's just going to subtract a bit every frame, and it's going to keep doing that until it reaches 0. Then we spawn a wave. And you can see down here, we start spawning that wave. We wait a little bit between each enemy. And each time we spawn an enemy, enemies alive is going to increase. And so this here is going to be true. So it's not going to do anything else than just spawn the wave and set the countdown equal to the time between waves. It's not going to go down here and draw any of this out on the screen. And it's not going to subtract from our countdown until the enemy here dies and we subtract it, or they reach the end of our level, until all of the enemies have gone through one of those two things, and in which case our enemies alive will again be 0, and it will continue down here again and start counting down. So that is kind of the base of what's happening, and it might be a bit confusing because we're kind of juggling both time and amount of enemies and a coroutine, and so that stuff can be confusing. But of course you can always use the link in the description to get the code off GitHub and see for yourself on your own system. So that should actually work now. So all we need to do is simply hit play, and we should see that for our first enemy it's going to reach 0 here, and actually it didn't reach 0 immediately. It actually went a bit further, and that's because after we start the coroutine here, we set the countdown equal to the time between waves. We actually continue down and subtract for just a single frame until we reach the top again. And all we need to do is just hit return here in order to make sure that we don't pass through all of this other logic when we begin spawning a new wave. And that should actually take care of that bug. So now when we hit play, we should see that it reaches 0, it stops, a new enemy spawns, and the second that we kill off that enemy, the countdown begins again, and when it reaches 0, it's going to spawn the next wave. Let's just wait for that to happen very quickly, and we can see that the next wave is now incoming, and it should feature 2 enemies. Awesome, and you can also see that the next wave won't start until both of these enemies are killed off, which is now. Cool. So I think with this new system, we can easily decrease our time between waves. Actually, I wanted to set it to only like 2 seconds, as long as we're just prototyping, and then we can always bump it up at a later point. So the next thing is allowing for more configuration when it comes to how many enemies we want to spawn each wave and what enemy prefab we want to spawn. And in order to do this, it's actually quite simple. What we need to do is go under our wave spawner, and we need to kind of have some list in here, more specifically an array, which is just a list of items where each element in the list has some specifications about the wave. So in order to do this, let's start by creating a class that will act as our wave, all of the data for our wave that we can then have a list of. So let's start by creating a new class, and we do that by just going under scripts, hitting create C# script, and let's call this one wave, and double click that to open it up. And of course we have to think about, well, what do we want each wave to kind of have in terms of information? What do we want each wave to know? And we also have to remove mono behavior here because we're just using this class to store a bit of information, some different variables. So first of all, we want this wave to have a reference to a prefab for the enemy that we want to spawn that wave. So we just want to go public game object, and we want this to be enemy. You could also go enemy prefab, we'll just say enemy. We also want an amount of enemies to spawn. So we'll go public integer, and we'll do count. And finally, we want an amount of time that should, or kind of a spawn rate actually. I think that's better than a time between enemies. I think we should have a rate. So let's just do public, float, and then rate. And we don't need to input any default values. That's totally fine. And one thing that we do need to do, because we want this to be able to show up in the inspector so that we could edit these these variables inside of Unity is we want to mark this as system.serializable. And that just means that we will notify Unity this is something that you should save a load, and this is something that you should display in the inspector once we actually turn it into an array. So when we then go into our wave spawner, instead of having our enemy prefab, we can then create a public wave and then the array sign here. So again, a list of items. And we want this to be our waves. And when we now just save this and hit into Unity, it's not going to work just yet. And again, we are referencing the enemy prefab. So I just want to get rid of that so I can show you what's going on. Okay, so let's just finish the logic here and I'll show you what it looks like in the inspector in just a second. So now each time we spawn a wave, we don't want to spawn an amount of enemies equivalent to our wave index. And we don't want to increase our wave index in the beginning. We want to do that after we've spawned the wave, because our wave index should start at 0 and then go 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. We don't want it to start at 1. So let's take our wave index here and move that down so that we increment it after our loop. And by the way that I'm moving lines up and down is by holding down Alt and then pressing the up and down arrow keys. It's a really handy thing inside Visual Studio. And a lot of code editors offer that functionality. So we want to increase our wave index down here. And first off, let's get the current wave that we want to spawn. So simply the wave that we want to spawn is of type wave, and we can just call it wave, and it will be equal to our waves at the wave index's position. So again, if it's the first wave, we are going to take the first element, which has an index of 0. So our wave index will be 0, and we're going to store all that information in wave. If it's the second wave, the wave index is going to be 1, and we're going to grab the second element and store it inside of wave. Then what we can do is go in here and say that we want to spawn a bunch of enemies, and the amount of enemies we want to spawn is wave.count. And so for I is equal to 0, as long as I is less than wave.count, we are going to keep on iterating through this loop. And we don't want to wait half a second between each enemy. We want to wait 1 divided by wave.rate. So again, we could just have put wave.time between enemies, and then we wouldn't have to do any kind of division. We could just input the number, but I think using a rate is just a bit more clean. So what we can then do is, of course, we also need to specify the exact enemy that we want to spawn. And so we'll just pass that through as an argument. So again, we'll create a game object here called the enemy or enemy prefab. Let's just call it enemy. And that's what we want to use here for our spawning. And we just need to pass that into a function. So in here, we'll just go wave dot, and you guessed it, we just go wave dot enemy. So this is just a much cleaner way of doing things. It's not as automated because we have to make each individual wave or level or round or whatever you want to call it. But it gives us so much more configuration possibilities and really allows us to create something that's much more fun for the end user. Having this idea of a wave that is kind of an object that we've created on our own with these different characteristics, and then storing a bunch of these waves in a list, and then just going through them one by one and using some of the properties in there to create different behaviors is kind of the core of object-oriented programming. So if you're able to understand this, you're going to be able to do so much with programming. And even if you're lagging behind a bit and think this is really hard, just right after me, don't worry about it. You will definitely get this. It was something I thought was really hard to wrap my head around, but once you master this, you're going to feel like you can do pretty much anything. So really great if you're getting what's going on here. So I'm just going to have a sip of water. And and we can continue. Cool. So this should actually work, and this should allow us now to go inside of Unity and see that there's no errors. Awesome. And we can now go under our game master and the wave spawner, and you can see that there's now a list in here. And we can increase the size of this list. Let's just input, say, 5 and have 5 different elements here. And we can collapse these and expand them. And each element, again, has 3 properties: our enemy, the enemy count, and the rate they spawn at. So now we can populate these, and this is really just about you going nuts with your imagination and just doing as much as possible. Of course, we'll have to kind of balance it in terms of not making each level too easy or too hard, or having a really big gap between one level and another. But it's really just about coming up with a bunch of things that you think could be really fun and varied for your players. So in order to do this, we have to go under our prefabs folder and maybe organize this a tiny bit. Actually, I want to create a totally new folder called enemies. And I believe, yeah, I actually created this earlier. So I have this enemies folder here, and I had this idea that I wanted to create at least 3 different types of enemies. I wanted to have a very simple one, which is much like the one we have now, where the speed is kind of in the middle and he has an average amount of health and stuff like that. He's not that special. Then we can create a really tough one with a lot of health, but who might be a little slower. And we can create some fast enemies who have almost 0 health and don't give that much money, but we can create a lot of them and they'll be moving through the level at a rapid speed. So let's take our enemy and enemy death effect and use that as a base for our symbol enemies. And we can go in here and maybe just add symbol to the end of the names of these objects here, just to make it very clear what's going on. And we can also find under our materials our enemy material and drag that in as well, and add again underscore symbol to that. So now we have everything grouped in that folder. And I don't really want to change anything about these enemies. I think they are working just fine as is. So let's go and make a few waves using this enemy type. So let's drag in enemy symbol. Let's increase the count to say 1 for the first one, and the rate to 2, so that means 2 enemies a second, but again, we're only spawning 1, so it really doesn't matter. It's just to satisfy my OCD. Then for the second wave, I think we should still keep it really simple and easy. So let's do a count of 2 at a rate of 2. And for our third element, which is of course index 2, we can maybe create a new type of enemy, or we could just kind of bump up the count here. Let's just get as much as we can out of this enemy type until we explore new ones, just to let our user kind of figure things out on his own. So 5 enemies at a rate of 2, I think that's going to be fine. And now for our fourth wave, I definitely want to do some variation. So let's take our symbol folder here and let's actually just duplicate it. Let's remove the tough folder and let's just rename this to tough. That's just easier to have this to work off. You could of course create a totally new object, but it's much easier to just duplicate things and then just modify the things that you need to modify. So we're going to rename all of this to tough, enemy tough, whoops, not tough symbol, enemy tough. And let's do the same thing here, enemy tough, and enemy death effect tough. Cool. And then we can take our enemy tough and we can bump up his health. Let's do something like 300, maybe even 350. I think actually 350 could be pretty cool. And we can take our start speed and set it to maybe 7, so he moves a lot slower. And also definitely bump up his worth to something like maybe even 140 to really make him much more valuable to kill. And let's now take our enemy tough material and drag it under the materials here. So we make sure that it doesn't use the symbols material. And let's do the same with our death effect. So if we go under our renderer on our death effect, we have to drag in enemy tough for that death effect. And we also have to go into our enemy tough and drag in the correct death effect. So there's a few things that you need to make sure that you link up properly. But once you do that, it's really, really easy. Then next up, you could of course increase the scale here to make him a bit bigger. And I definitely recommend that you do so if you think it would be cool. But what I'll do instead is actually go in and edit our material here. You can do both, but I'll just edit the material. And I want to make this a tiny bit more kind of red and maybe even add a bit of metallicness just to make it darker and kind of more grungy. Cool. So now if we just drag in our enemy tough, I think it looks pretty cool and I definitely think it's acceptable. So let's just use that as a base, and you can always spend more time playing around with this stuff than I do. So now under our game master and our wave spawner, we can just take our enemy tough script here and drag it in there and set the count to something like 3 at a spawn rate of 1. So, and for our fifth and final element, I'm again going to duplicate the symbol folder, and let's remove our fast folder here, and let's rename this one to fast. And again, I just want to link up everything, so let's start by renaming this stuff. So this is going to be enemy fast, again enemy fast for the material, and enemy death effect fast. Then we can take our enemy fast here, drag in the correct material, drag in the correct death effect. Let's take the death effect, drag in the correct material there as well. We can then change the material to something, I think a yellow would be pretty cool. Definitely want it to stand out a bit. Something like that looks pretty cool, I think. And I definitely want it to be bright. Maybe even brighter than this. Something like that looks pretty cool. And then we can go in here and simply edit some of its stats here. So let's change the start speed to something like 20 and our start health to something really low. Let's just do 15. And we can also maybe set its worth to something a bit less. Let's say 25. And that should work just fine. So again, let's go under our game master. Let's drag in the prefab. Let's set the count to something much higher. Let's say 10. And set the rate also to something really fast like 3. Awesome, so that should actually already work. And if we just go in here now and hit play, we should see that these waves are indeed spawning. So there's the first guy, and let me just show you that the second ones are working as well. Indeed they are. But before we go through this, we have to fix one bug, and I'm just going to go out and say that there is a bug so that we don't have to go through the entire level only to find out that something isn't working. And that is when we reach the end of our level. So when we don't have any more waves prepared, meaning that we've gone through all 5 waves, it's going to increment our wave index. So the last level has an index of 4. And so the next level, which doesn't exist, is going to have a wave index of 5. And when it then goes through here, spawns the wave, and tries to get the wave here, it's going to be unsuccessful. Because if we try and get the 5th element of our wave array, it's going, or the 6th element with an index of 5 of our wave array, it's going to give us a null reference exception because that doesn't exist. So what we need to do is add just a tiny bit of functionality, basically just an if statement here saying that if wave index is equal to waves.length, so if it's equal to the amount of total waves that we've created, well then we want to end our level. We could just say you won the game, or we could transition to a new level. And you guys have been requesting me to do multiple levels for a long time, and it's definitely something that I would like to do. The only thing that I'm kind of waiting on is a bit of graphical updates. I want to create some more interesting graphical pieces before we go on to creating new levels. But I definitely want to leave some code here that allows us to easily transition to a new one. So in order to do that, all we kind of want to do here is just throw a debug.log statement with something like wave or level 1. And of course we want to call something on the game manager or something like that, but for now we'll just say that in here. And then we want to disable this script so that we don't keep on spawning new waves. And to do that we simply go this.enabled equals false. And we haven't had a look at using this.enabled really, but all we're saying is that this script, we want to disable it. Cool, so we can save that now and things should work without any kind of weird errors. So let's just hit play here and enjoy what we've been creating. So let's see here. So let's create a standard turret first. I think that's kind of a good base. And one thing that I know is that our missile launcher works pretty well against the standard units. So I'll go ahead and create one of those. If you'll shoot, awesome. And I know that this laser here works really, really well against really, really quick units because it shoots continuously, but they don't have a lot of health. It's really, really great against fast opponents who might just escape the bullets of some of the other turrets. So I think we have a pretty good defense set up here. And of course, right now, you can see there how effective the laser turret is on trying to create some or kill some of these enemies. And now that we are through all 5 levels, or all 5 waves, you can see down here that it says level 1, and that's awesome, and we can transition to the new one. So it's just going to be stuck here and wait till we do something with it. You can display a victory screen, or you can make your own new level and transition to it. That's totally up to you, but at least I think this was a really important upgrade. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you find a lot of fun ways to play around with this. Really, it's only your imagination that should stop you at this point. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks to all of the awesome Patreon supporters who donated in November, and a special thanks to Sultan El Sharif, Faisal Marifai, James Calhoun, and Robert Bonham. Become a patron yourself at patreon.com/Brackeys.